All right, so this is a talk about Tailwind CSS. This talk assumes a level of knowledge about CSS. So if I say something that doesn't make sense, or you have a question about, please feel free to interrupt me. I think it's more important that you learn something than I get through all my slides. So no worries there. So CSS has some problems, and I don't think that's a hot take. First of all, naming things is difficult with CSS. Uh, it's not a unique problem. This has plagued programmers everywhere, but I do think CSS has some unique aspects to it that make it hurt in different ways. So for example, sometimes you need to wrap your element inside of a div, and if you have to name, or when you name that parent div, it is one of the most painful experiences ever. So say you're wrapping a button, do you call that parent div button wrapper, button container, something else? It's kind of esoteric what you decide to pick, and I think it'll change from day to day. Second, CSS can be really difficult to scale. So I think most sites start with the idea that the code is going to be perfect and it launches and it's totally fine. But eventually, more people join the project. You need to start to carve out your own place of the world with these incredibly specific selectors so you don't leak anything out. Um, and all it takes is one person doing that to kind of start a problem. And once that problem exists, it's kind of difficult to solve. We can use linters to stop that from happening in the first place, but those only work when we obey them. So this is from website, and what it's saying is there are 231 instances where we have told the linter, I know I'm breaking a rule here, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Some of these aren't that bad, but some of them can get pretty ugly. Like this. So for the OZU keeping score at home, that is 7 classes and an ID. This isn't me picking on whoever wrote this. Sometimes it comes out of a place of necessity. So if someone else has already written something super specific and you also need to target it, don't get blamed. I feel really bad for including this already. You kind of need to do one of two things. You can add to the duct tape and make it even more specific with what you're doing, or you can try to solve the root problem. This is tech debt. You can either spend some time doing it right, or you can get moving quicker and kind of add to the problem. It does feel like CSS tech debt doesn't get repaid nearly as often, though, and I think that's because it can feel like a house of cards, and everyone's afraid to knock it over. Lastly, CSS can be slow to write. I'm going to talk about what we do in website here, and this is using a CSS framework called Less. So if you need to work on a new feature that doesn't have a style sheet associated with it already, you have some annoying work in front of you. So let's say you are working on a brand new page that has a hero section. What you need to do to get your styles associated with that page is abandon your editor, most likely, and go to a shell, navigate to app styles, create a new folder that will encompass your new feature, navigate into that folder, create a file that is going to be what you're specifically working on. So in this case, it would be hero.less. You then need to create all.less, which will eventually be all of the different parts of this page imported. And of course, you need to import hero.less into all.less, and then you need to import all.less into our master less style sheet. This doesn't happen too terribly often. Most of the time you're working with the style sheet that's already been created, but when you do have to do this, it's just annoying enough. Especially if all you wanted to do was change the text color and you had to modify a file, create 2 files, and create a new directory. Now, I'm not the first to notice that there's a problem with some of these things, and there have been some attempts to solve it. So to try to combat the problems with naming, there is BEM, and this is what we use in website. This is a methodology for how to name your classes. It stands for block element modifier. It looks like this. So if you were to name a class, it would be the block followed by 2 underscores, followed by the element, followed by 2 dashes, followed by the modifier. If you look up BEM examples, it is obvious that there is no concise answer on what is a block, what is an element, and what is a modifier. This can lead to inconsistencies, And what's the point of having a methodology if you're not following it consistently? Um, this is where I was going to make that XKCD joke is you have another competing standard that if it's not followed all the time, what's the point of it? Another approach to solving the problems of CSS is CSS in JS. This is where instead of writing your styles in CSS, you write them in JavaScript, and that gets parsed and turned into CSS that the browser can understand. So going clockwise, we have JSS. This is not to be confused with JavaScript style sheets, which was something Netscape made back in '96 that no one used. That's my favorite piece of web development trivia. There's also Emotion, which is the only CSS and JS library that makes their logo high quality and easy to find. Um, Bottom right is Vanilla Extract. I don't know if anyone here has used it or heard of it, but it sounds super cool. You use TypeScript as a preprocessor, so you get type-safe, locally scoped files or styles. I want to dig more into this because I don't know enough about it. But lastly, styled components. All of these require you to either still name your classes or you're working in a file that's outside of your markup. The final solution to combating CSS is utility classes. And according to the United States Web Design System, yes, that's a real thing. Utility classes are simple classes that are tightly scoped to a single CSS property. This is something that's easier to understand by looking at than listening to me. So if we wanted to change the color of text to red, a utility class for that might look like this, where it's text red, and the only thing it's responsible for doing is changing the color of the text. I think utility classes answer a lot of the problems with CSS. They're easy to name because it's a single responsibility. So it's a lot easier to name something when it's only responsible for doing one thing. You don't have to carve out your own space in the world with specific selectors because you're really avoiding the cascade of CSS. All of these styles are low level and have the same level of precedence, so you don't have to worry about overriding one with another. Now, you will have to spend some time writing these utilities, but once that's done, you could just stay in the markup and use them as much as you want. But what if there was a way that you could get all the benefit of a utility class without spending the work to write your own utility class library? And that's the crux of this talk. This is Tailwind. So Tailwind describes itself as a utility-first CSS framework where designs are implemented using only low-level utility classes. For right now, you can think of Tailwind as just that. It's a collection of utility classes that have already been written. So you don't have to be the person that writes the styles for text red or border blue. That's already been done for you. In fact, it's been done to the extent that you kind of get a free design system when you use Tailwind. So all of the colors have been defined, different levels of spacing, typography, shadows, all of the design tokens you would expect to create yourself have already been done. And what is talking about code if you don't actually look at code? So we're going to switch gears here. And we're going to recreate an expedite button, the default one. So it's this nice, pretty looking button. And we're just going to try to see how long it'll take us to do this with Tailwind. So to do that, we are going to use this website, play.tailwindcss.com. It is a sandbox environment that has Tailwind pre-installed. It's fun to play around with if you just want to try some things out. So this is all the default junk. We're going to get rid of that, and we're going to write a button. Please excuse any bad typing. I do not have my Vim bindings in this, and that is just going to slow me down. Luckily, it's pretty forgiving about indentation and all that. Oh, we have a button. We're almost halfway there. So since Tailwind is a collection of utility classes, let's start to add those. The first thing we notice about the expedite button is it has a green background. And to do that in Tailwind, we can say background. Next up, we add our color. And what you'll see from our IntelliSense here is Tailwind ships with a bunch of colors. What we need here is green. And then we can specify our shade is 900. And we'll also make the text white. This button is already almost indistinguishable from an expedite button, but we're just going to go a little bit further. So we know that the expedite button has some padding associated with it, so we can add that with P. And we'll say P, we've looked down the list. We notice that each of these is incrementing by a quarter of a rem every time, or 4 pixels. So why not P6 or 24 pixel padding around top, right, bottom, and left? But actually, if we go back, and a keen eye might notice that it's actually 24 pixels on the left and on the right, and 12 pixels on the top and the bottom. So let's do that. If we only want to target our left and right, we can just do px because we're doing the padding on the x-axis, and you can do py for the y-axis. And we know that py3 obviously is 12 pixels. We're also seeing that this button is a little too square to be an expedite button, so we can say rounded full. And it's also a bit too tall, so we'll change our leading. It's kind of hard to see this button in the corner, so we're just going to move it down with a div. And you could have guessed that M5 is margin. There we go. So it looks pretty decent, but it doesn't do anything when you hover, and I think that's a pretty important part of a button. And Tailwind makes it really easy to add those pseudo classes. So we can use the hover term, and we can change our background color. Say this is background grain 700. Now when you hover, it changes colors. It is a little abrupt though, so why don't we add some animation to it? This is something for me personally that I always look to an example for, or kind of spend a little bit too much time writing animations in CSS. Luckily in Tailwind, it is a breeze. So we can say ease in, out, and we want that to last for 300 milliseconds. There we go. Our button is looking a little bit better. When you hover, that transition is much cleaner than what we had before. So that's enough of this. We've looked at our markup. Why don't we see what the CSS tab has to offer us? So you might have expected to actually see some styles here, and what you'll find is this @Tailwind directive. So this is how Tailwind is injecting all of its classes and styles into the final CSS style sheet. That happens at build time. All you need to know is you can import them if you want to. If you only need, say, the base or the components, you can pick and choose what you bring in. There's a couple more directives that aren't here. There's @layer, and this is a lot like the new CSS @role, where you can have an element with a lower specificity still be used, which is really handy if you're working with like third-party components and you don't want to fight their specificity with @important or important selectors. Layer makes that super handy. And the last directive we'll talk about is @apply. This is going to break real quick, but let's say we wanted to use this button in a few other places. You have two options. If you're using a front-end framework, you would probably make this button into a component and then just use that component where you need. But let's, for the sake of the argument, pretend that we don't have a CSS framework and we need this button again. So instead of copying and pasting and having this repeat of all of this class string, what we can do is use the apply directive. So we can give this collection of classes a name. Button. If we do @apply and go to our string of classes, and we're going to bring that over. So we have essentially given a collection of styles a class name. That humor is not lost on me, that we've come full circle. But if we say niche button here, we get back our fancy expedite looking button. And if we use that, we don't have the duplication in our markup. It's contained into that class. And the last tab here is for the configuration. I mentioned you get the design system for free, but you're not locked into it. You can overwrite any part of that that you want to. I'm actually going to overwrite the colors here. So I'm telling Tailwind that I only need white and I only need 2 flavors of green. And if you notice, these look a lot more like the expedite button that we were trying to hit in the first place. So here's what our goal was. And here's where we ended up. That is not too far off. And it only took us a handful of utility classes to get there. So you can imagine how these classes can start to become the building blocks of a whole user interface. That said, though, it's not a replacement for learning CSS. This isn't a new problem. I think you'll find that some people try to learn React before they learn JavaScript. And I think it's the same here, where you're going to be better off if you understand the fundamentals before jumping into a layer of abstraction. And also, Tailwind isn't going to help you that much if you don't know the difference between like padding and margin. So if it's not a replacement for CSS, what is it? It's actually just a shortcut. In my experience, the not having to leave your markup and having these short utility class names has made me super productive because I can get styles banged out super, super quickly. I don't think that's changing anytime soon, unfortunately. So this is me saying I'd be remiss to tell you if Tailwind is not all sunshine and rainbows. So a few pain points with it is you're kind of having to relearn CSS. So I know when I'm writing the background color of CSS, it's background color. When you're learning Tailwind, you have to learn what's the equivalent of background color in Tailwind. So it's an abstraction that takes time to learn. The good news to that, though, is the documentation is the absolute best. I would say it's the best documentation of anything I've ever used. And to prove that point, I've never looked on Stack Overflow for a Tailwind question. I've always been able to figure it out myself just with the documentation. It can make your markup kind of ugly. So if you think of our button that had a handful of utility classes, imagine if you had 5 different components, each of them had 10 to 20 utility classes. It can be questionable when you first see it. And the only way you'll believe me is if you try it, you get used to it. It actually isn't that ugly after a while. And it also has the benefit of you know what something will look like without having to leave your markup. So before, if you saw a button had a class of fancy button, you would have to go track down what that actually meant in your style sheet. But with Tailwind, you know exactly what that button is going to look like. Lastly, I mentioned you get a design system for free, but so does everyone else. So if you're not careful, your site can look like every other site using Tailwind. If you remember when Bootstrap came out, it was really easy to tell if a site was using Bootstrap without actually looking at the source. It's the same thing here. You have to put an effort in to not look like every other site. So if you haven't heard of Tailwind until today, you might be wondering why I'm shilling for a random CSS library, but it's not just me that uses it. Wealthfront is a company that does automated investing. They use Tailwind. Netlify is a web hosting service, and they use it in their app. Hacktoberfest, that great yearly event where you get a free t-shirt for fixing your own white spacing issues, they use Tailwind. GitHub uses it on their landing page. And not lastly, there's Netflix. They use it for some marketing materials. And lastly, a tiny search engine used it for their IO marketing page this past year. So with all that said, I like it. All those companies like it. Not everyone likes it. You'll have such an easy time finding people online that think Tailwind is the worst thing to have happened to CSS ever. So I would encourage you to just give it a try for yourself and listen to both sides and kind of form your own opinion rather than just echoing one side. And that includes me. Go out and see if you like it. And if you don't like it, you can have complaints with it. That's totally cool. And with that, we are ready for questions. Happy to answer what my experience has been like, how utility classes are different than inline styles, anything in between.